Welcome in, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. This one's pretty heavy, but it's a story that really needs to be told. We're looking into the murder of James Craig Anderson in Jackson, Mississippi. It happened back in 2011, and we've got a detailed account from a true crime podcast to dig into.
Yeah, this case is one of those that goes way beyond just the crime itself.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at the events leading up to the murder and the whole social and historical context. It's going to be intense, but also really fascinating.
Definitely. We're not just going to focus on what happened, but also like why it happened and what the aftermath was like. But to really understand all that, we got to start by talking about who James Craig Anderson was.
Everyone called him Craig. He was 47 years old, African American, and had been happily married to his husband, James, for 18 years.
They had a son together, too, an adopted son. And from
Okay.
everything we know, Craig sounds like he was a genuinely good guy.
Yeah, he was really active in his church, loved to laugh,
Oh.
always had a smile on his face.
He was actually just a few days away from his 48th birthday, and they were planning a trip to Chicago to celebrate.
A trip that he tragically never got to take. In the early morning hours of June 26, 2011, Craig found himself locked out of his car.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was in the parking lot of the Metro Inn in Jackson. And his husband, James, was working the night shift, so Craig was all alone.
It's like the middle of the night, you're stranded. It's something that could happen to anyone, right?
Exactly. And for Craig, this unfortunately turned deadly.
Oh, gosh.
So there were these two groups of white youths. One was in a Jeep Cherokee, and the other was in a Ford F-250 pickup truck.
Yeah.
They had been at a party, and they pulled into the parking lot.
Okay.
At first, it seemed like they were going to help him, with the car. But then things took a really dark turn.
What happened?
They started throwing racial slurs at him, taunting him, and then it quickly escalated to physical violence. One of the youths, John Rice, punched Craig, knocking him to the ground.
That's awful.
And it gets worse. Daryl Dedman, the one driving the Ford truck, he started brutally beating Craig while shouting racial slurs.
Oh, my God. Were the others just standing there watching?
It's chilling. Some of them were actually laughing while this was happening. But what's even more disturbing is this wasn't just a random act of violence.
You're saying this was planned.
In a way. These groups, they'd been going on what they called hunting expeditions into Jackson.
Hunting expeditions.
Yeah. They would specifically target black people that they perceived as vulnerable.
That is so messed up.
And get this wasn't even their first time. They had a history of attacks like this. There was a beating near a golf course, a near hit and run, and even an assault that they tried to disguise as a drug deal.
Seriously?
And they had this awful nickname for Jackson. They called it Jaffrica, which tells you everything you need to know about their mindset.
That's just disgusting.
This is way beyond teenage mischief. This was deeply ingrained racism fueling their violence. We even know that Dedman had family connections to white supremacist groups.
Oh, wow. It's like hate being passed down through generations.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how deep this prejudice really runs in some communities.
Yeah, it's like they didn't even see Craig as a human being. He was just a target to them.
Right. And this case highlights a really important point. This wasn't just some isolated event. It's directly connected to the long and complicated history of racial tensions in Mississippi.
That's true. You can't understand something like this without understanding the history.
Mississippi's past is full of the legacy of slavery, the Civil War, and the fight for civil rights.
Yeah.
And those scars, they don't just disappear overnight.
It's not ancient history either. It's a past that still shapes the present in so many ways. And even though there has been progress, these deep-seated issues are still simmering under the surface.
Exactly. And it forces us to ask the hard questions. How could something so brutal still happen in 2011?
It makes you wonder how far we've really come.
Well, that's what makes this case so important to break down. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths and look at how those historical wounds haven't healed.
It's a wake-up call for sure.
It shows how easily hate can erupt, even in what we consider to be modern times.
So after the attack, what happened? Did anyone even try to stop it?
Thankfully, there were witnesses at the motel. They called 911.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, and between those calls and some security camera footage, the police were able to identify and arrest the perpetrators fairly quickly.
You'd think facing those consequences would make them realize the gravity of what they'd done.
You'd hope so.
Right.
But from what we know, that wasn't always the case.
Really?
Yeah, some of them, especially William Montgomery, the one who was driving the Jeep, he showed a shocking lack of remorse.
Wow.
Even years later, he refused to take responsibility for his actions. He even went so far as to claim that he was a victim of reverse racism.
That's unbelievable. It's like they just couldn't or wouldn't see the reality of what they had done.
It's a disturbing example of how difficult it can be for some people to admit culpability, especially when it comes to race. But let's shift to the legal proceedings. How did the justice system handle this case?
Yeah, what were the outcomes?
Well, they definitely didn't let it slide. Dedman, the one who ran Craig over with his truck, he was initially charged with murder,
Okay.
but then those charges got upgraded to capital murder.
Capital murder. What does that mean?
Basically, they determined that Craig was killed during a robbery. Remember, Dedman stole Craig's phone and wallet and even his wedding ring.
Right.
So that elevated the charge to capital murder, which carries a much harsher sentence.
So what was his sentence?
In the end, Dedman received 2 life sentences, plus an additional 50 years on federal hate crime charges.
Wow. That's essentially saying he's never getting out.
Exactly. It emphasizes just how seriously they took this hate crime.
What about the other guys involved? Did they get off easy?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
Rice, the one who started the attack, got 18 years and 4 months. Butler, who was present but didn't physically participate, still got 7 years.
Okay.
Even the others who were involved in those earlier hunting expeditions, but not directly in Craig's murder, they all faced federal hate crime charges as well.
So it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. They were actually held accountable.
Right. It's interesting to note that this was actually the first time that the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 was used in a case where the victim died.
Oh, wow. So this case was kind of a landmark case.
Absolutely. It was a major victory for civil rights advocates because it showed that the legal system was finally starting to recognize the specific harm caused by hate-motivated crimes. But legal action wasn't the only avenue for seeking justice in this case. Craig's family also filed a civil lawsuit against all 7 youths involved.
That makes sense. What was their argument in the lawsuit?
Their argument was that even those who didn't physically assault Craig were negligent because they didn't try to stop the attack or call for help.
I see.
It's a powerful statement about shared responsibility. The idea that if you witness something like this and do nothing, you're complicit.
It's a strong message for sure. Did they win the lawsuit?
Our sources don't give us a clear outcome for the entire case. But we do know that the 4 main perpetrators, Dedman, Rice, Butler, and Montgomery, were ordered to pay a combined $840,000 in restitution to Craig's estate.
That's a significant amount of money. You'd hope that would at least help ease the financial burden on his family, though obviously nothing can ever truly compensate for the loss of a loved one. It's also tragic that Craig's husband, James, wasn't able to join the civil claim because Mississippi didn't recognize same-sex marriage at the time.
Yeah, imagine being denied your right to seek justice for your murdered husband simply because of discriminatory laws. It adds another layer of injustice to this whole tragedy.
It's heartbreaking, but it also highlights how interconnected these issues of social justice really are. It's a reminder that the fight for equality must continue on all fronts. So, back to the case itself. Was there any insight into why they specifically chose Craig as their target that night?
The district attorney in Jackson put forward a chilling theory. He believed that Craig was simply the first vulnerable black person they encountered.
Oh, wow.
Their goal was to inflict harm, and anyone who fit their twisted criteria could have been their victim. That night, it just happened to be Craig.
That's terrifying. The thought that someone could be filled with so much hate that they would do this to another human being, it's almost too much to bear.
It's a question that continues to haunt us all. Where does this hate come from? And how can we possibly stop it?
It's overwhelming, but we can't afford to turn away from these hard questions. We
Yep.
can't just shrug our shoulders and say that's just how it is. We have a responsibility to do better, to be better.
Absolutely. And in the midst of all this darkness, it's important to remember that there's also light. There's an incredible resilience in the human spirit. And this case isn't just about hate. It's also about the power of love and the strength to fight for justice.
I'm not sure I follow you. What do you mean?
Think about Craig's family, his husband James. They were dealt an unimaginable blow, but they didn't let it break them. They channeled their grief into action, advocating for change, for justice. They refused to let hate win.
Their courage in the face of such tragedy is truly inspiring.
And their efforts, along with the countless others who spoke out, made a real difference. Remember the passing of the hate crime ordinance in Jackson and the removal of the Confederate emblem from the state flag? Those were direct responses to Craig's murder.
That gives me a glimmer of hope. It shows that collective action, people coming together to demand better, can actually create change.
It's a powerful reminder that our voices matter. When we speak up against injustice, when we demand accountability, things can change.
Those sentences for those guys, I mean, they were harsh. Did that really send a strong enough message, though?
I think it went beyond just punishing those individuals.
Yeah.
You know, it was a statement to the community and to the whole country that hate-motivated violence wouldn't be tolerated.
Yeah, but did it actually change anything in Mississippi?
Well, that's a tough question. On one hand, you have concrete steps forward, like that hate crime ordinance in Jackson, and even the removal of the Confederate emblem from the state flag.
Yeah, those are huge. But you mentioned earlier that some people were in denial about the racial motivation behind this whole thing. Like they
Mhm.
just couldn't accept it.
Exactly. There was a portion of the white community that refused to acknowledge it as a hate crime. Some saw it as just an isolated incident. Some even blamed Craig, saying he was in the wrong part of town.
It's frustrating. It shows just how deeply ingrained prejudice can be, even when all the evidence is right there in front of you.
It highlights the fact that dismantling systemic racism isn't just about laws and punishments. It's about changing hearts and minds.
And that's a much harder battle, for sure. Speaking of which, we have to talk about James Craig's husband. He could have easily retreated into his grief after all of this, but he chose to speak out to become an advocate for justice.
Imagine the strength it took to stand up in court, to relive the pain of losing Craig, and to demand accountability.
He didn't want Craig's death to be in vain.
His voice, along with countless others, forced people to confront the reality of racism and hate. They made it impossible to ignore.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can emerge, and individual voices can truly make a difference.
And his story and Craig's story are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power to rise above hate.
This deep dive has been a roller coaster of emotions. It's been a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of hate, but also a powerful story of resilience and the potential for change.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by stories like this. But remember that even small actions can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a question to think about. What can you do in your own life to challenge prejudice and hate? How can you be an ally, a voice for the marginalized?
It might feel like a drop in the ocean, but those ripples can create big waves.
It starts with awareness, with empathy, with having those difficult conversations.
It starts with each of us choosing to be a part of the solution.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a lot to think about. And remember, the fight for justice is ongoing. We all have a role to play.